For today's prophecy update, we're going to focus a lot on the Middle East and some of the things going on in Syria, but I have a few introductory things I want to get through first. Again, we talk each week about this convergence. We know that the focus in the end times will be on the Middle East, but there are all these other things that are going to happen, and they all seem to be converging right now. I'll give you an example of some of those things. We've talked a little bit about this in the past. This is a seminar that was advertised in The Economist the other day called Pride and Prejudice. It says this: the business and economic case for LGBT diversity and inclusion. And they're having a seminar in New York City next weekend, or this week, that you can attend, and it's sponsored by IBM and Biogen and a number of other large companies. And this is, I think, where you're going to see this more and more in corporate workplace. It's going to be an issue that you're going to have to deal with and decide. And it's not, frankly, the law, in my view, is not going to change anytime soon. Something you're going to deal with for at least a generation, one of which is, of course, it's a great editorial cartoon from Michael Ramirez at Investors Business Daily, probably the best conservative editorial cartoonist on the planet. You see this: the Scalia was the dam that was holding back judicial activism. And I'm not going to go into all the different theories about what happened to Justice Scalia and the secret hunting society and the secret society that he might have belonged to and all this stuff. All I know is that in his legal work, he stood as a constitutional originalist. He was conservative, and he held back the tide, literally. He was the dam that held back judicial activism for a generation. He'd been on the court for almost 30 years. His no longer being on the court is very problematic. I think I mentioned to you that there was a major decision, environmental decision, that the Supreme Court intervened in a lower court case in a very unusual manner in a 5-4 vote and shut down some of the regulations that the Obama administration had enacted and put into place to regulate especially coal-burning power plants. Without somebody like Justice Scalia, that vote would have been 4-4, and the regulations would have gone into effect with major, major economic impact. Just so you know, the federal government does put out a financial report. They have this one this year. It just came out for fiscal year 2015. It's interesting, having been involved in litigation over how good financial statements are, and you always want to, these need to be prepared in accordance with what they call GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles, and some of you accountants will know exactly what that is. This is the statement, though, that's in the report from the General Accounting Office, which is the watchdog that evaluates how the government is doing, and it says this about the report: certain material weaknesses and internal control over financial reporting and other limitations on the scope of our work resulted in conditions that continued to prevent us from expressing an opinion on the accompanying accrual-based consolidated financial statements as of and for the fiscal years ended September 30, 2015 and 2014. So that's a nice way of saying is we don't think these are reliable because of the way they prepare them. And they cited a number of reasons, like the Defense Department's accounting system is a total mess, and we don't know what's going on there, and there were some other areas. There's some interesting findings in that report. For example, what we own and what we owe. The government has certain liabilities, and but you will see that the liabilities here on the right, that bar is much higher than the assets on the left. Okay, that's called bankrupt in a private company. But the government gets away with it. So the government's assets and liabilities as of September 30th, 3.2 billion or trillion in assets, and total liabilities, which are really, I think, understated, of $21 trillion. That doesn't include certain things like Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid. Some people say that the unfunded liabilities of the United States government exceed $100 trillion. So you could tax everybody 100% and you wouldn't be able to pay for it, essentially. Well, that's not exactly true. Tax them 100%, because you can only tax them 100% one time. Take everything. So you have to at least let them have a little bit. So somebody got upset with me last week because I said Bernie Sanders was going to tax everybody, certain people at 99%. He said, no, it's really only 52%, and it's really only over $10 million in income, or whatever the number was. But the other side of that is, if Bernie Sanders was going to pay for everything that he wanted to do, he would have to tax people at 99% or above, because it's fantasy land. But listen, this is an interesting, okay, the government held about $3.2 trillion in assets, mostly $1.3 trillion in net loans receivable, primarily student loans, and $893 billion in net property, plant, and equipment. So young people are you are our asset, what you owe the government for your student loans. And there was a young lady on Facebook or Twitter or someplace, and she posted about, I never eat out anymore, I can't afford anything, I have the student loan to pay off, I bought a 10-pound bag of rice, and that's all I've been eating for the last 3 months. Rice, 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 every night. It's just, my life is miserable. And then somebody went and looked at her Facebook account, and they found pictures of food that she's cooked at home. So it didn't quite, be sure your Facebook will find you out, I guess is the moral of the story. Here's a little chart. Now, I know that doesn't mean anything to me because I can't read it. But this is a chart. Things that are to the right are things that are performing well economically since the first part of the year. Things to the left down at the bottom, you see how the chart gets bigger, that the further down you go, the worse it performs. So at the top of the chart, this is just a little bit, the best performing asset class in America has been lean hogs. I didn't even know you could invest in lean hogs. So, and do lean hogs have bacon? That's what I wanted. That's really the critical question. But then you see the other performing assets are gold, silver, Dow Jones utility average, all the way down to milk, soybean, corn is down there just up a little bit. And then at the bottom, though, is an interesting thing. For example, you see sugar is down 8.8%. Cocoa is down 10%. And that's because all the people paying back their student loans are eating rice, right? They can't afford chocolate. Crude oil down 14%, Argentine peso 15.6%, and you see there down at the bottom, gasoline and natural gas, 23.7% decline since the first part of the year. That is problematic for much of the world economy. I saw that, I know you'll have a lot of sympathy for this. Homes in River Oaks section of Houston that used to cost $2.2 million are now going for $1 million to $1.3 million. So if you have, you want to buy a bargain house in River Oaks in Houston, you can go down and pick one up with no problem. This is an interesting thing that we've talked about, is this headline from, I believe it's the Washington Post or New York Times yesterday. Japan lost nearly 1 million people in the last 5 years, population-wise. Remember, they used to talk about how Japan was going to outgrow the islands that it's on, and they wouldn't have enough space and all this other thing. They're in a population decline. They are really one of the first countries that's showing the demographic decline that's coming to most countries in the West because of low birth rates. And Japan will, within a generation, probably have half the population that it does now. That's probably the most closed society on Earth. Now, this is an interesting picture here on the right. This is what's going on in Japan right now. That is a picture. The headlines in Japan are, we're all sold out of safes. We no longer have any safes available in hardware stores. Now, why would that be? people are hoarding their cash and they want some place to store it. Why? Because the Bank of Japan a few weeks ago or a month ago put in negative interest rates. You have to pay the bank money to keep your money in the bank. And so what do the Japanese people do? They're intelligent people. You know, they make great cars. They design a lot of really cool things. They're taking their money out of the bank. And now you can't you can't find a safe in Japan. So I think some entrepreneurs are going to figure out how to import safes to Japan, and they're going to make a bundle. This is just an interesting statistic. America's most vacant cities. Flint, Michigan has 11,000 vacant homes. Detroit, 81,000. Youngstown, almost 7,000. Beaumont, Texas, and Atlantic City between 4,000 and 5,000. This is a map of the vacant homes in Detroit. 50-some thousand homes within the city limits of Detroit. 53,000 homes within the city limits of Detroit. And they're vacant. It's like 1 out of every 5 homes in Detroit is vacant. So, and Detroit's actually doing, in some respects, is doing okay economically. I know it doesn't make any sense. Well, we talked about this last week. The world is sort of in a deflating mode. Not flat yet, okay? I know that a lot of people believe in a flat earth, but it's just deflating. There's an increasing number believe in a flat earth. That's a topic for another time. In Matthew chapter 24, Jesus said this when his disciples came to him on the Mount of Olives, and as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, verse 3, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world?" And Jesus answered and said unto them, "Take heed that no man deceive you. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many." So the first thing he says is, don't let anybody deceive you. And that's a constant theme throughout, particularly these teachings of Jesus, that in the end times, deception will be rampant. We talk about this all the time. It just appears that when you step back and take an objective look at it, it seems like the world is going mad. I don't know if you're like me. I assume that a lot of you are. I can't watch those things they call debates. It's embarrassing for both sides. It's just this is what we get. This is the best we can do. Verse 6, Jesus said this, Matthew 24, "And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you be not troubled. For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom." Does that sound a little bit like the world is in that kind of mode? "And there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places. All these are the beginnings of sorrows." So we know that these things will reach a peak, a climax at some point within the 70th week of Daniel. But all the foundations of that are going to be in place. So I think the things, if we're that close to the 70th week of Daniel, I think the things that we're seeing are the building blocks for what's going to unfold within that 70th week. For example, here is something on trying to hold off disaster. There is a major drought underway in Ethiopia. And there are probably over 10 million people in serious risk of not having water or food. And the relief agencies don't think that they can keep up with it. Now, understand that the Bible says that there are these times of trouble coming. If the relief agencies in the world are unable to handle the 10 million in Ethiopia effectively, logistically, what happens if this becomes a third of the world in major drought or half of the world in major drought? It doesn't bode well, as Pastor Steve talked about. Your only hope is really in Jesus Christ. A friend of mine went through the USGS earthquake statistics, looking for earthquakes, and he prepared some charts. He has massive amounts of data. And what he did was he looked for just frequency of notable earthquakes 6.0 or above. Now, I'm sure, like you, if you have Facebook, you get people like, oh my goodness, there was a 3.1 earthquake in Southern California. Well, 3.1, that's me running down the stairs or something, That might actually be a 4.2, but that's for falling down the stairs is a 5, so not exactly what you would call light on my feet. But look at the increase in this from 1910s at the left with those less than 50 on this scale to over 400 in the 2000s. That is an enormous increase just from the 1990s to the first decade of the year 2000. Now take that tall one there, and I'm going to show you it on the next chart compared to this decade so far, since 2010. Okay, now you see the tall blue thing there next to the tall green thing? That's the 2000s one. So this is how it compared all the way back to 1900. Now we're going to look at it and add this in, and the increase is a 444% increase. Now, Jesus said that there would be what in the end times? Earthquakes. Now, I know what everybody will say. Oh, we're just better at detecting them now. Okay, believe that if you want. I do think that there has been a significant increase in earthquakes. You can make of that what you want. Well, for the rest of this, we're going to focus mostly on Syria and the Middle East because that's where things seem to be going on. And Syria is sort of right now the epicenter of the focus of the world. All of the major world powers, from United States to Russia to even China to the Middle East countries, Turkey, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, all of them are involved in some way in Syria. Sometimes they're supporting people on both sides of the conflict, like we are. We like the Kurds. We support the Kurds. We support some rebel groups. Now the Kurds and the rebels are fighting, and so what do we do? And it gets very, very complicated very quickly. This has its genesis in the Sykes-Picot Agreement from which was signed, negotiated actually. They were in the midst, almost near the end of the negotiations of this, 100 years ago, in the early part of 1916. In May of 1916, they signed the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and this map here is the picture of the actual map that they use, and you can see the signatures down there in the lower right-hand corner of the people. This is what they signed. And this was how they were going to divide up the powers of the world. They're in the midst of World War I, and so the French and British mainly, and to some extent the Russians, got together and decided how they were going to divide up the Middle East. A was going to be French, B was British, and they then, after they followed up on this after World War I ended, and they started creating countries. So in about the early 1920s, they created a country called Iraq. It had not existed before. It was a made-up country. And when they made it up, they knew that there were Sunni Muslims, there were Shiite Muslims, and there were other sort of non-religious and ethnic groups, all of whom hated each other. So the only way that country would hold together was you needed a very strong dictator. Jordan was created, Transjordan, and then, of course, eventually Israel was parceled off, also in the 1920s, a homeland for the Jewish people. Syria was created at that time. It was another mishmash of just a whole bunch of different ethnic groups. Today, we see these pictures from Syria, and we see picture after picture after picture of rubble, buildings destroyed. I have some testimony given, or statements given before the House Armed Services Committee by the the Supreme Commander, a man named Breedlove, General Breedlove, Supreme Commander of the NATO forces in Europe. And he testified before Congress just the other day. There's a lot of talk about is this going to be World War III? Is this the beginnings of World War III? And most people think we're, at least because of all the different powers involved from all over the world, we probably are in the beginning stages of World War III. There's a lot of talk over the last couple of weeks about Saudi Arabia has 350,000 people, and they're getting ready to invade Syria, and Turkey and Saudi Arabia are working together, and Russia's going to use tactical nukes and all this stuff, and this will be the start. This is going to melt down in the next couple of weeks. Now, it may be that that's the case, but you need to understand that militarily, Saudi Arabia is an incredibly weak country. One of the, and I can't remember, I think I got this from the Gatestone Institute analysis of this. Saudi Arabia is the weak, oh no, I got this from George Friedman's new think tank, Geopolitical Futures. Saudi Arabia is the weakest of the Middle East's four major powers, Turkey, Israel, and Iran being the other three. So I'm a little bit on the skeptical side when I see that Saudi Arabia is going to mount this invasion with Russia there in Syria. I'm not personally seeing it, but it could happen. So it's just something, but it does bear watching. It says this, Friedman, in the end, if there is one country that can help the Saudis protect themselves from Iran and the Islamic State, it is Turkey. But Turkey is Sunni Muslim. Saudi Arabia is largely Sunni Muslim. They have a very significant Shiite population in the eastern part of the country of Saudi Arabia along the Persian Gulf is Shiite Muslim, and that is where their oil is. So it's a very delicate religious situation for the Sunni monarchy in Saudi Arabia to manage that situation. Turkey is also Sunni. And Turkey, I don't think there's any question but that Erdogan, the head of Turkey, would like to establish himself as the head of a new Muslim caliphate, revive the Ottoman Turkish Empire. He is a radical Islamist. He himself said many years ago, he got in trouble for saying, there's no such thing as moderate Islam. So do you believe what he said, or do you want to believe other people who don't understand that particular religion and want to say, oh, no, it's not that, you don't understand it? He's a proponent of Islam, and he says there is no such thing as moderate Islam. This analysis said this: Ankara sees itself as the leader of the region and the wider Sunni Islamic world, and thus is in competition with Riyadh. So Turkey is in competition. Who's going to control the Sunni world? Given that they have to deal with the Iranians on many fronts, the Turks are all the more cautious about the Saudi sectarian agenda. Turkey has a history of being relatively secular, but that has radically changed over the last 15 years as Erdogan has come to power and consolidated power. Things that used to be banned, like the veil and burqa and stuff like that, in Turkey, I understand, are being seen more and more as this fundamentalist Islam sort of rises in that area because of the leader. It's a major problem. So we have all the world powers there. We have Saudi Arabia and Turkey trying to figure out how to deal with Iran and Russia and Syria. Now, 6 months ago, if you analyze the situation last summer in 2015, you might say there's no way that Assad survives it much longer. The country is in total collapse. Well, then what happened? Well, Russia came in. So, we have all these major players that we see in end-time prophecies are now right there on the borders of Israel. And they're fighting. Now, they supposedly entered into a ceasefire agreement, but there is a lot of concern about the Russian component of this. Here is the UN came out with a report about this, what's going on, and there's probably about documented now that there's over 500,000 Syrians have died since the conflict began back in early 2011, 5 years ago. Here is the EU foreign minister. I'm not going to try to state her name. Here's what she had to say about Russia. You guys might need to pump this up because I think the volume's a little low.
We are always referring to Syria as the proxy war among regional actors. This risks to become something bigger than this. I'm not thinking of a Cold War. No, we risk a hot war among different actors than the ones we always think of. Not necessarily Russia and the United States, but Russia and Turkey could be. As Europeans, we have a clear interest in trying to contain and scale down the tensions.
So she thinks it's a hot war. One of the things that's happening is the Russian ruble seems to be in decline, and so this is why a lot of people think Russia's going in there. It's to divert attention from its own economic problems, so its people focus on an external enemy. And here's another analysis that said, although an uncontrolled collapse of the Syrian regime seemed feasible in June 2015, Russia's intervention into the Syrian civil war has ultimately reset the military balance in Syria, and that's an understatement. That's from the Institute for the Study of War. The other thing you need to keep in mind, too, is the ethnic composition of what's going on there. This is an area of a lot of ethnic groups. For example, when they did this ceasefire agreement that went into effect yesterday, of course, they had Syria and Russia, and John Kerry was there. I don't know why he was there, but he was there putting in his 2 cents worth, and Iran, of course. But the Syrian rebel groups, there were 97 of them that they had to get on board. Now, is it any understanding why that maybe they haven't been able to take down Assad when the 97 can't get along with each other? So they haven't been able to coalesce around a unified goal or vision, and so that's why Assad has been able to hang on as long as he had. The other interesting thing, though, is this Kurdish population. You see the sort of olive green things in the upper right-hand corner of Syria, and then also in the upper left-hand corner along the Turkish border. The Kurds are the largest ethnic group on the planet without their own country. They're the descendants of the biblical Medes, the Medes and Persians that you read about in Daniel. They want their own country. They have a lot of oil in their area. They have some support from us. Turkey doesn't like them. There have been some bombings in Ankara recently, and they blamed that on the PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party, that's tried to get a separate state for the Kurds. They're also in Iran and Iraq, and so now they're involved because they've been brought in because the Islamic State is bumping up against their territory and taking parts of their territory, so they're coming in. You go over to the coast of Syria and you have the Alawite Muslims. It's a very small minority of Muslims. The Assad clan is Alawite Muslims. They're more closely, have more affinity with Shia Islam. So you have Shia Iran, you have Alawites, Shia sympathetic, and then Russia kind of sticks its finger in the mix, and then you have the Sunni Islamic State that the Sunni Saudi Arabians don't like the Sunni Islamic State, and the Sunni Turkish people don't like the Sunni Islamic State. And you have a recipe for something that's very, very difficult to figure out, to say the least. The Institute for Study of War puts out great publications every week, and their analysis usually seems to be pretty good. And they say that Aleppo is being taken back by the Syrian regime, the Assad regime, with the help of the Russians. They're pretty much in control of Latakia province right now. They're getting Syria back, and so you see this yellow area in the middle. That's where these 97 groups are. And then the brown area is Jabhat al-Nusra, that's an al-Qaeda affiliate. And then the gray area is ISIS, and then the Kurdish are in purple in this particular thing. So what the Institute for Study of War does that I kind of like is they do war gaming. They sit down and they talk through what do you think is going to happen? If this happens, what happens? If this, and then they sort of take all that data and they come out with the most likely scenario. So they've kind of got a 90-day forecast as to what we can expect. So here are some of the findings that they have in that. It is likely that Russia will continue to target Aleppo despite the cessation of hostilities, claiming that it is simply continuing the campaign against Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS. And they were excluded from the ceasefire agreement. If you can go ahead and attack those people still. So there's a ceasefire, but you can still fight. So what do you think Russia is going to claim? Do you think they're going to claim when anything that they do is against ISIS or the al-Qaeda affiliate? Of course they are. They haven't really been doing much anyway in Syria. The Syrian regime has reestablished its battlefield momentum, and the political process continues to falter. Nobody can come to agreement. They say this: current conditions threaten to draw regional actors deeper into the conflict. For example, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain have all messaged their willingness to deploy ground troops into Syria. Again, whether that's true or how much of a force they can mount is anybody's guess at this point. Turkey, of course, has a very large army. The persistence of high-casualty terrorist attacks inside Turkey could incentivize Turkey to escalate its cross-border kinetic activity. In other words, they're getting drawn in to the battle because they're getting bombed in their capital city. This report also says that a direct conflict between Turkey and armed Kurdish groups would challenge the U.S., which maintains delicate relations with two key components of the U.S.-led anti-ISIS campaign. I mentioned that earlier. The U.S. would be forced to choose between its cooperation with the Syrian Kurdish YPG or to sacrifice its relations with Turkey, a key NATO ally. So if they help the Kurds, Turkey gets mad at us. And so it really is a situation where you can't do this. Here's what they conclude. The conflict would likely allow ISIS to resurge in northern Syria and secure additional border access with Turkey, reversing months of effort in the international anti-ISIS campaign. The violence would ultimately fuel regional disorder that would undermine the pursuit of U.S. strategic objectives in Syria and Iraq. Now, General Breedlove, he went to the Armed Forces Committee in the House, and he gave some testimony about this. One of the things, the headline from the Hill says, Russia wants to rewrite the international order. And so I have some testimony of his. Let me back this up.
Today, Europe faces security challenges from two directions.
Now, he's going to talk, I'll back it up for just a second. I'm going to talk about Europe's challenges because that's where he's stationed. He's head of NATO, the Supreme Commander of NATO. But he's going to talk about that because the Middle East impacts what's going on in Europe. And you'll understand this when you listen to what he says. So here he goes.
Today, Europe faces security challenges from two directions. First, to the east, Europe faces a resurgent, aggressive Russia. Russia has chosen to be an adversary and poses a long-term existential threat to the United States and to our European allies and partners. Russia is eager to exert unquestioned influence over its neighboring states to create a buffer zone, and Russia is extending its coercive influence yet further afield to try to reestablish a leading role on the world stage. Russia does not want to challenge the agreed rules of the international order. It wants to rewrite them.
He went on to say this, that the era of trying to work with Russia is over, and he was making an argument for rebuilding of U.S. forces in that region, which is not a politically popular thing here in the United States. Here's some more of what he had to say.
To the south, from the Levant through North Africa, Europe faces a complicated mix of mass migration spurred by state instability and state collapse, and masking the movement of criminals, terrorists, and foreign fighters. Within this mix, ISIL, or Daesh as I call them, is spreading like a cancer. taking advantage of paths of least resistance, threatening European nations and our own with terrorist attacks. Its brutality is driving millions to flee from Syria and Iraq, creating an almost unprecedented humanitarian challenge. Russia's entry into the fight in Syria has wildly exacerbated the problem, changing the dynamic in the air and on the ground. Despite public pronounces to the contrary, Russia has done little to counter Daesh, but a great deal to bolster the Assad regime and its allies. And together, Russia and the Assad regime are deliberately weaponizing migration from Syria in an attempt to overwhelm European structures and break European resolve.
Okay, so his conclusion, based on what he sees as he said, they're weaponizing migration. Now, how are they doing that? They're trying to cause migration from the Middle East to Europe of all these different groups that don't share European values to collapse the European Union and NATO. Here's what this is how, I think this is a pretty good analysis. This is how he says they're doing it.
Again, I look at what I see in capabilities and capacities, and then I determine intent. So what I have seen in Syria, in places like Aleppo and others, are what I would call absolutely indiscriminate, unprecise bombing, rubblizing major portions of a city that do not appear to be, to me, to be against any specific military target, because the weapons they're using have no capability of hitting specific targets. They are unguided, dumb weapons. And what I have seen in the Assad regime from the beginning, when they started using barrel bombs, which have absolutely no military utility, they are unguided and crude, and what are they designed to do is terrorize the public and get them on the road. Later, Assad using chlorine gas and other chemical-type approaches to these same barrel bombs. Again, almost zero military utility, designed to get people on the road and make them someone else's problem. Get them on the road, make them a problem for Europe, to bend Europe to the will of where they want them to be. And so I see a continuing pattern in Aleppo and other places of this indiscriminate use of military capability, that all I can determine from it is the goal is to get more people on the road and make them a problem for someone else to bend the will of those being affected.
It's a brilliant analysis, I think, of what's going on. And if you look at the pictures, I've shown them many, many times here, Syrian cities are just absolutely reduced to rubble. You can't live there. The cities are trash. Nobody's going to live there for a generation. So people aren't going to hang around there. They're going to go someplace else. Now, there's also a lot of immigration from Muslim countries in Africa, Muslim immigration from there. And so this is a major problem for Europe. Europe is talking about, there's all these reports, you see these all the time. Europe is doors slamming shut across Europe. It's a problem. What are you going to do? Greece is really on the verge of collapse. So all of this, I think, sets an in-stage thing for somebody to come on the stage to say that they have the solution. How that works out exactly, I'm not sure geopolitically. There's a lot of things that I think have to fall in place. But to be sure, the world is set up for it. There's chaos all over the world. This is a picture of a supermarket in the socialist workers' paradise of Venezuela, where they're out of food. They have no food. Now, in this hearing, they talked about an article from Robert Kaplan. I'll just read some excerpts from this. Kaplan wrote a great book a couple years ago about something about geography and war. And, geography really does control a lot of where we are. Israel is at a pivotal point in the Middle East because it sits on essentially the land bridge between Europe, Asia, and Africa continents. United States has been blessed geographically. We have oceans on both coasts. We have relatively benign countries on our north and south border. In Canada, you have a pretty, very, very benign country, maybe a little less so with the southern border. But, and we're protected. And we have this great geography where the breadbasket of our country has water, transportation access to major ports. That helped our economic development tremendously. It's a country unlike any other in the world geographically. So here's what it talks about, the Eurasia's coming anarchy. He's talking about Russia and China. They're in major economic distress. And when that things happen, a lot of times we'll see war. As China asserts itself in its nearby seas and Russia wages war in Syria and Ukraine, it is easy to assume that Eurasia's two great land powers are showing signs of newfound strength. But the opposite is true. Increasingly, China and Russia flex their muscles not because they are powerful, but because they are weak. China and Russia, it is domestic insecurity that is breeding belligerence. This marks a historical turning point. For the first time since the Berlin Wall fell, the United States finds itself in a competition among great powers. The world has seen that kind of anarchy that ethnic, political, and sectarian conflict can cause in small and medium-sized states. But the prospect of quasi-anarchy in two economically struggling giants is far more worrisome. As conditions worsen at home, China and Russia are likely to increasingly export their troubles in the hope that nationalism will distract their disgruntled citizens and mobilize their populations. As policymakers contemplate their response to the growing hostility of Beijing and Moscow, their first task should be to avoid needlessly provoking these extremely sensitive and domestically declining powers. That said, they cannot afford to stand idly by as China and Russia redraw international borders and maritime boundaries. The result of all of this could be Yugoslavia light, violence and separatism that begin in one place and spread elsewhere. As Moscow loses control, the global jihadist movement could take advantage of the vacuum and come to Russia's outlying regions into Central Asia. Bad as this sounds, things could still get worse. I doubt that he's read Bible prophecy, but Putin will try to play on Europe's need for Russian support to force Europe to acknowledge his annexation of Crimea and his de facto rule over eastern Ukraine. But just when a firm response is most needed, Europe is looking less and less likely to be able to provide one. In some ways, Russia's current crisis parallels that of Europe, which is also dividing into core and peripheral areas. And talking again about Russia, by frightening states into re-solidifying their borders, the migrant and terrorism crises will also exacerbate the EU's divisions and inevitably NATO's as well. Such disunity will make Europe's attempts to confront Russia even more hesitant and disorganized than they are today. And he goes on to talk about this. And then Breedlove also talked a little bit more about the Russia desire to foment chaos. And that's not
exterior chaos is a tool that Mr. Putin likes to use to give him a platform to show that the great power of Russia needs to intervene in a West that cannot bring order to the world. And it gives him that platform to try to talk about the great Russia as an equal player on the stage, bringing order. The second piece that you talked about, sir, is domestic crisis inside the nation. I believe Mr. Putin is using a crisis inside his nation. I do believe that his people are feeling the dropping in oil prices, the sanctions, and the other things affecting his government. But he uses that to focus them on an external enemy to bring their focus to what he wants to do with his nation and his power. And he is now focusing his people completely on the United States first and foremost, and secondarily NATO, as an external enemy that they need to be ready to rise up to meet.
And, as we've said in the past, Putin's a chess player. He's very good at it. So here's a conclusion. Russia's fight is not about defeating the Islamic State, but about expanding its sphere of influence in the Eastern Mediterranean, including the mouth of the Suez Canal. In a way, Russia is challenging NATO through Syria the same way Turkey is challenging the Shiites through Syria, or Iran is challenging the Sunnis through Syria. And all this is taking place on the borders of Europe. I'm going to talk a little bit about Israel in the Middle East and some of the things going on. In Parliament this week, there was, in England, there was a discussion. First, you're going to hear somebody from the Labour Party talking about, he's a pro-Palestinian, and then you're going to hear Prime Minister James Cameron's response. So here's the person from Labour first. There we go.
Last week, I visited Palestine along with several of my honourable friends, where we visited the home of Nora and her family, who have lived in the old city of East Jerusalem since 1953. However, Israeli settlers are now trying to force Nora from her home of over 60 years, and there are many other cases. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that illegal settlements and constructions are a major roadblock that hinder peaceful negotiations? And what is this government doing to help prevent the infringement of into Palestinian lives and land?
Here's James Cameron.
Let me say, I think the question the honourable gentleman raises is incredibly important. Look, I am well known as being a strong friend of Israel, but I have to say the first time I visited Jerusalem and had a proper tour around that wonderful city and saw what has happened with the effective encirclement of East Jerusalem, occupied East Jerusalem, it is genuinely shocking. And so what this government has consistently done and gone on doing is saying, yes, we are supporters of Israel, but we do not support illegal settlements. We do not support what is happening in East Jerusalem, and it's very important that this capital city is maintained in the way it was in the past.
Well, he's no friend of Israel. Netanyahu responded in very stark terms. Only Israeli sovereignty ensures Arab residents of the city have roads, clinics, places of employment, and all other means of normal life that their brothers do not enjoy throughout the Middle East. Only Israeli sovereignty ensures the rule of law for all, something that does not exist in Iraq, Yemen, Syria, Libya, and large areas of the Arab world, including the Palestinian Authority and Gaza. Only Israeli sovereignty ensures all of that, and it is important that our friends in Europe will remember that simple fact. This week, there was a bill that was signed into effect, Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act of 2015, and the Republicans had put in the bill things that were favorable to Israel. And so this is President Obama signing the bill, but he issued a signing statement as to how he's going to interpret the bill. And so this is what he said. And look, George Bush did this, so we shouldn't expect this. Provisions of the act address trade with Israel. I have directed my administration to strongly oppose boycotts, divestment campaigns, and sanctions targeting the state of Israel. As long as I am president, we will continue to do so. Certain provisions of this act, by conflating Israel and Israeli-controlled territories, are contrary to longstanding bipartisan United States policy, including with regard to the treatment of settlements. So there you have really what Obama thinks. And so people are pretty upset with him. There was also a bill passed through committee in the House. It's a bill that will require the Secretary of State to submit a report to Congress on the designation of the Muslim Brotherhood as a foreign terrorist organization and for other purposes. I think the way they're putting this through the House and the Senate, they hope to have that in place at the end of Obama's administration, because he would just veto it for sure. So the Judiciary Committee issued a press release about it and said this: the Muslim Brotherhood continues to pose a global threat. The jihadist movement actively supports and finances terrorist networks around the world, including Al-Qaeda and Hamas. The United States must recognize and sanction the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization as part of our national security strategy. The Obama administration has been hesitant to call the Muslim Brotherhood a terror group, even as its allies have determined the group to be a threat. Caroline Glick wrote an article about the lie of pro-Palestinian activism. I'm getting a little bit short on time here, but essentially what happened was at the University of Chicago, they had a person named Bassem Eid, I don't know how you say it, EID. He was a pro-Palestinian activist for many years, but in 1994, when the Palestinian Authority took over areas of the West Bank and Gaza, what they call the West Bank and Gaza, he sort of then focused on human rights abuses by Palestinians against Palestinians. So he came to the University of Chicago, and as Caroline Glick, who used to live in Chicago, said this, he has dedicated his life to defending the human rights of Palestinians. As a human rights activist until 1994, Aida directed most of his criticisms against Israel. Since then, he has defended Palestinian human rights from abuse at the hands of the PLO and Hamas. Until 1994, his human rights activism made him the darling of the far left. He got invited to all these seminars and conferences and that type of thing. But since the Palestinian Authority was formed, those who once upheld him as a hero have turned their backs on him. In doing so, they have shown their true colors. And during his talk at the University of Chicago, those colors came shining through. Here's just a brief clip from the Q&A session that took place at the end of his talk.
Talking about Palestinians crossing the checkpoints to go inside and work inside Israel. You're talking about the Palestinians that are being hurt by the BDS because they're losing some jobs in the West Bank. You're talking about BDS and SGPs working in Europe and not working in Palestine. But can you talk a little bit about what brought us here today?
What?
What brought us to this division? What brought Palestinians to a place where they have to go work for their occupiers? Today, who told you to represent Palestinians and speak for them?
Excuse me. You start your question.
Yeah, I'm
with
asking
the
you
very bad words in Arabic, by the way. With the very bad words in Arabic. Excuse me. I'm not going to answer your question.
Sounds like Fox News.
Why did we get to where we are? Why are Palestinians are divided today? You don't want to take your camera down. Excuse me, no one asked you to film. Take your camera down.
So look, there's all these activists out there. They have all these protests about the suffering, the horrible conditions in the West, what they call the West Bank, really biblical Judea and Samaria. So I did some research this week, and I found some pictures of some of the things that are fairly new construction in those areas. You want to see them? Here's a couple homes in Ramallah. Here is the Nablus Mall. Here is a couple homes recently built in Karas by Palestinian leadership. Listen, folks, you do not understand the suffering. Do you know how much it costs to run a pool like that? I mean, in a desert? Here is the brand new Jasir Palace Hotel in Bethlehem. And more about that in just a moment. Here's a new Palestinian town that's being built called, I don't know where it is, Rawabi. Now, at the Palace Hotel in Bethlehem, by the way, in another 7 days, another week from tomorrow, will be the fourth conference. They had it in 2010, 12, and 14, and now 2016. The fourth one, the Christ at the Checkpoint Conference. And so they will go to this Palace Hotel, and they will talk about how horrible the suffering is. And there are poor areas in the West Bank and Gaza, but I'm telling you that the Palestinian refugee camps in Jordan and Syria are far, far worse than anything you will find in Israel. This is about getting rid of the Jews. And if you look at this online, you'll see the link to there's a whole bunch of pictures of homes and buildings and everything that have been built in Ramallah and other areas, Nablus and other areas of the West Bank, even down into Hebron. It's not an area that's devoid of economic activity. Gatestone Institute has an article this morning about the World Council of Churches starts 7 weeks of brainwashing regarding Palestine. That's what they're doing for Lent. The World Council of Churches is recommending for Lent that they do things about the lack of water for the Palestinians. And it's all based on lies. But the whole thing is based on lies. But look, this is what we should expect, because the Bible tells us that there will be this very strong anti-Semitism in the end times. And we see it increasing week by week by week, day by day by day. And Israel's becoming increasingly isolated. And even its old friends, like England, Great Britain, like the United States, and their leadership are backing off. I mean, Cameron's a conservative politician in England, but he's backing off his support of Israel. So that's just sort of a summary of this week's news and things that I think are important, touching on Bible prophecy themes. So we'll take it up again next week. So let's pray and we'll get out of here. Lord, I pray that you will help us to take this information, analyze it in light of what the scriptures say, and leave here and redeem the time, knowing that the time is short to share the gospel with our friends and neighbors and family. I pray that you'll give us plenty of opportunities to do that. Give us the words to say when we have those opportunities. Bless us as we go this week. In Jesus' name, amen.